Hey everybody, I'm Winter, and I'm pretty well known for talking too much and maybe a bit too long about real-time strategy games. Overwhelmingly Starcraft 2 over the last decade, but recently Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition and other RTS titles. I've played Age of Empires 4 throughout the open and closed betas for several dozen hours, and I have a lot of strong opinions and feelings on it, good and bad. It is in my nature and just professionally to look at it through a competitive RTS lens. There are a lot of positive and negative points that I'm going to try to go over in depth, especially from that perspective. So with that said, make sure to the bell and let's get started.
Go, go, go! My life for Ireland!
Though Age of Empires 4 did not advertise itself as a competitive RTS, just having that name at the beginning and knowing that the Age of Empires 2 scene is still going so strong even to this day, and as a StarCraft 2 player, honestly, I'm looking for almost anything I can get at this point. I still have a lot of reservations about Age of Empires 4, and I will go into explicit detail about many of them now. I hope that if you're watching this after Age of Empires 4 is released and deciding on whether you'll pay a not small amount for it, it's helpful, and you understand the perspective I'm coming from. Age of Empires 4 has a lot of checkered points. Between the graphics, the UI, there's a lot left, I think, that could be improved upon. But one thing, especially, that is very important to me and is generally iconic in the Age of Empires series: sounds and music. For the most part, the sounds of the units in game are pretty incredible. There are a few little issues with certain dynamic sound filters, aka sounding like maybe you're inside an auditorium when it's supposed to be an open space, but these are things that were improved upon between the betas, and I think will be improved even more by release. When the units run into battle, they let out a cry as they run down the hill into the pikemen you didn't mean to send them to, but, I mean, at least we can enjoy their dramatic deaths. Units now give you an alert, sometimes maybe a little too ambitiously, when they see an enemy unit instead of being attacked by it. So a scout seeing an enemy army will yell the alarm. The massive battles, especially between the boom of the siege weapons and cannons, as well as the yelling of all the units on both sides in their respective languages as they go into battle. The actual sound of the battle and the game is pretty incredible. Age of Empires 4 does a very good job of making it feel like a medieval battle, with a few quirks here and there, but hopefully those can be worked out. I think Age of Empires 4, when it comes to the sounds, is a worthy successor to the games before it, especially the game it seems to be most inspired by, Age of Empires 2. Now, my absolute favorite part of the game, as it stands, is the music. The music for each civilization is unique. The menu music is unique. The music in-game is affected by what's happening in the game, and it's very clear. You couldn't script it better most times. When the battle swells, there's multiple soundtracks for each civilization that seem to fit the scale of the battle as well. When the game transitions from passive farming and building of your walls to a enemy at the gates, then the music will swell dynamically and bring you into the moment, and you don't even notice it's happening. That's how natural the transition feels. And then, as the battle ebbs, the music as well goes back to its original, more calm state. When you advance your civilization to the next stage, the music swells and the soundtrack itself changes, even the passive one that's usually in the background, as well as the music for battle. The music is one of my favorite parts of Age of Empires 4 overall, and I think bodes very well for the campaign, single-player, co-op missions, custom games. There's a lot of cool stuff that could be done with it. My only complaint is sometimes the music stops playing. Like, I noticed a few times that maybe I took a little too long to age up, which you can do if you stop building the structure that is required in Age of Empires 4. and the music just kind of stopped. It's like, you're gonna finish, you're gonna get to the Castle Age, you're gonna do it. So I would rather the music didn't chastise me like that in-game. Okay, I'm getting hit by the intercontinental ballistic longbowman. But otherwise, the music is definitely a great part of the game. If I had to slap a number on it for the in-game sounds, I'd give it 7.5. There's still a lot of those little quirks that ideally and hopefully are worked out, but overall it sounds very good. When it comes to the music, it's a solid 9 out of 10. Overall, I think the sound and the music do justice to the Age of Empires series, and it definitely feels like a successor in that sense. This is the high point of Age of Empires 4, in my opinion, from either a more casual or competitive perspective. Age of Empires 4 has graphics. That's about as confident as I can summarize, because there are several different aspects to go into, some of which are quite good and some of which leave a lot to be desired. Pretty much everything in the game that doesn't have to move between one part of the map to another looks pretty great. The environment, the grass, trees, deer, except for the deer that run away when I'm trying to hunt them, they all look and to an extent sound great. Buildings and the aesthetic around them, especially when your civilization develops over the ages, the paths between the buildings become more advanced and paved over. The buildings themselves obviously show signs of technological progression. Just generally, the way you interact with the world becomes more and more immersive, as the trees are much more of a part, for better or worse, of things than Age of Empires 2, and the environment is much more relevant than Starcraft 2. Now, the not so great. Pretty much everything that has to move from place to place, or shoot something, or attack something, in my opinion, leaves a lot to be desired, especially as a competitive player. The animations are, I think the best description I can come up with is janky, between laser-guided arrows that never miss, and no matter what, they will find a way to hit their target, no matter what laws of physics be damned. Those longbowmen were well before their time. And just generally the fights and the interactions with the way the unit models are, they leave a lot to be desired. In fact, I think even to this day, StarCraft 2 has a superior look to the units themselves and their animations. The fact that the way the units are distinguished is not how their armor necessarily looks, but instead by the length of their weapons, which feels like maybe we're compensating for something. But instead of a pikeman having a particular helmet, like in Age of Empires 2, or an armor look, he just gets a fancier pike. This is all well and good up until you get a few dozen units together, and then it quickly becomes difficult to tell the difference between them. Now, this isn't unique to Age of Empires 4. Every strategy game has this to some extent, but I think in Age of Empires 4, there is still some work potentially to be done on the visual clarity of units and their animations. Just generally, and only to touch on this now because we'll get more on it later, the zoomed-in feel of the game, which has already been in the second beta, pulled back a bit, just literally does not give you the ability to see as much of the relatively cinematic battle that you possibly could. Sometimes I find myself panning between screens just to see the admittedly great-looking ships fire at one another. Trebuchets are sometimes out of range. This isn't so much on the graphics, but the lack of ability to appreciate. Another thing, for better or worse, and I personally am not a fan of it, but this is definitely more subjective in my opinion, are yellow outlines. You've seen them in the trailer, and you're going to see them a lot in-game. Everything you build and everything outside the fog of war will have one of the 4 colors available in Age of Empires 4. We have yellow, blue, green, and orange. Everything else will somehow and at some point fall under that category, but more on that later, especially when we're talking about the interface. Overall, the game looks good. The battles look good. Sometimes. There seems to be, and I hope this is something beta related, some sort of fog filter or shader that has a tendency to make the units that already look very similar very washed out. There's a couple maps that did not seem to have that shader that looked quite clear, especially even if you did zoom in spectator mode or something like that. So I hope for release and in the future, maps are made without this more artistic feature. I think prioritizing visual clarity of the units and just the ability to see the battles is far more important than any sort of immersion or aesthetic effect. Just to summarize, and while graphics, especially in a strategy game, I should know, are not the most important thing, they also shouldn't get in the way, in my opinion. And as a competitive player, I would have to rate Age of Empires 4 graphics at a 5 out of 10. Mostly inoffensive, nothing special, but also sometimes getting in the way. Now for the most important part of any real-time strategy game, gameplay. Overall, my experience with AOE4 is that the gameplay is a lot of fun. There's a lot of fun mechanics, it's immersive, it's fun to play in teams especially. Age of Empires 4 gameplay offers a lot as the next generation of a more casual strategy game that, while you're not going to be breaking your wrists, you're still going to enjoy. Age of Empires 4 is set in the same era as Age of Empires 2. You have your dark, feudal, castle, and imperial age, and while they're not exactly called that, the units are incredibly similar. You've got all the way from archers to hand cannons. You've got siege weaponry that ends up maybe slightly more advanced than Age of Empires 2, but around the same era of time during that dark to imperial age setting. Age of Empires 4 has slight differences to Age of Empires 2 in how it feels, but mostly because units have gotten a lot better at doing what they're designed to do. Cavalry will move around without tripping over each other, archers have perfect accuracy, infantry kind of stuck at an odd in-between, but this is a little bit how it was in Age of Empires 2 as well. Units themselves look and feel like they do what they're supposed to do. The cavalry great at charging into the back line and ruining things like siege weaponry or villagers. Archers great at picking off slower moving units, especially en masse. Siege weapons great for breaking buildings or laying out AoE damage. Overall, the units are relatively responsive and intuitive. Age of Empires 4 features a dramatic shift in victory conditions. The default multiplayer game has 3 different ways to win. One is destroying all of your opponent's landmarks, which is a bit interesting. You no longer have to kill every building or villager, just taking down these key parts of each civilization is how you achieve victory. There are also sacred sites, which are a King of the Hill style objective that can only be captured by monks, and if they're controlled for 10 minutes, you attain victory. On top of that is wonders, making a cameo appearance. Wonders are relatively cheap, and if they're defended for 10 minutes after being built, that's how you achieve victory as well. Wonders are by far the most contentious point so far in Age of Empires 4, as they are relatively cheap, especially in team games. So we will see what the default multiplayer settings are on release. The maps are significantly more varied than Age of Empires 2, especially the water maps. Water maps in Age of Empires 4 are a highlight. I know this is going to sound weird, because especially in Age of Empires 2, they feel like a chore that many people will just Alt F4 out of. But water maps feel pretty great on Age of Empires 4. The ships are fun to use, if a little clunky, and the mechanics are relatively intuitive. So Age of Empires 4 definitely improves Age of Empires when it comes to naval battles and water maps. One issue with the maps is legitimate imbalance, in the beta at least. I once spawned on an island with access to 1 gold patch. My opponent had 3. Some people are just born lucky, I guess. But in a competitive RTS, luck is maybe not something you want to have too much of, despite what you say at the beginning of the game. Another arguable improvement in Age of Empires 4 is the resource gathering system. While resources are not necessarily more plentiful, they are streamlined in the process of gathering them, whether this means gold and stone being large single patches as opposed to smaller patches strewn throughout. Gathering wood is less punishing. It's not as obvious how slow your wood production is further away from a lumber camp. Food especially early on in the form of berries and hunting animals, is very plentiful and no longer rots on the ground if you aren't perfectly efficient. And boars are no longer the existential and very real threat to the populace that they are in Age of Empires 2, for better or worse. Also updated is the grid system for building. While in all RTS, Starcraft 2, and AOE2, buildings are on a sort of grid system, it is very apparent in Age of Empires 4. Buildings will be built along that grid system even if you don't click the exact location. Now, I personally would like some more customizability on that, but it makes it a little easier for the T90s of the world to place farms accurately by just clicking nearby a mill and automatically having those farms placed. I think this is actually a pretty decent change that could use some tweaks. One of the relatively major changes is the way you move into the next age. Instead of just clicking a button on your town center and letting it go for X amount of time, you now build a landmark building, whether it's a cathedral or a blacksmith or some other building with some functionality. You choose from that, and once it completes, you enter the next age. Which building you choose and how you complete it and how quickly you complete it is mostly dependent on you. And I think this is one of the best changes in Age of Empires 4, because no longer is it, there goes 500 food and we'll see you in a couple minutes, but instead it is, how many villagers do I want to have build this cathedral? Do I want to choose the military or the economic landmark? Where do I want to place it? Because you can't replace it afterwards. More details include gold being required even to age up into the feudal age, which is not as big of an issue to acquire as Age of Empires 2. There are neutral trading posts, so the ability to trade in 1v1, even on water maps, is there, which is a significant difference to the wood and food-based late game of Age of Empires 2. As featured in so many trailers, you can walk and put units on stone walls, which has a mild practical effect. Also, stone walls cannot be attacked by anything but siege weaponry, which is, while thematically accurate, a little frustrating when it comes to the pathfinding of melee units. The game still features your classic rock, paper, scissors of units. You have melee, mostly countering other melee and cavalry, archers countering melee, and cavalry countering archers and siege weapons. The lines become a little blurred with the unique units and attributes of each civilization, but overall your classic rotation is there. Age of Empires 4 overall has a quicker pacing in the early game. You start with 6 villagers, where have we seen that before? And everything is gathered per villager slightly more quickly than Age of Empires 2. You also have the ability to see how much income you're gathering and plan a little bit further ahead than in previous games. One of the defining characteristics of Age of Empires 4 is civilizations and their diversity. Because of the landmark system built into the game and the way civilizations move to the next age, each civilization of the 8 at release will have its own set of potential landmarks and ways to move in to the next age, on top of some significant bonuses and unique attributes. Whether it's the English getting significantly more food from their mills or having a landmark in order to produce longbow at a kind of ridiculous speed, or the Mongols just floating their buildings, walking their buildings to the corner of the map and pretending like they're not still in the game and they're AFK. There are large differences between the civilizations that affect how the game plays out. There is still the core units that everyone can build, at least to a significant extent. You have your basic archers, you have your long swords, you have your cavalry. And then each civilization has its own unique units, usually more than one compared to AOE2. And this is definitely something that will be interesting going forward. I'm still not sure how I feel about the significant differences, but the game so far feels like it still boils down to the classic archers versus infantry versus cavalry, with siege weapons in the mix. The differences between the civilizations are definitely more pronounced and will lead to a lot less standardized build orders. Even if the cost of the landmarks are similar, their effects are dramatically different, from increasing your economy to literally giving you another castle. Overall, I think Age of Empires 4 is a fun real-time strategy game. It has a lot of interesting mechanics, and it brings a lot of new stuff to the table that adds diversity without feeling cluttered. The fact it's been pared down essentially to 8 civilizations at launch means you can really focus, kind of more like Starcraft than Age of Empires 2, on what your style of play is and what you like to build. A lot more than the 39 civilizations of AOE2. Between the streamlined economic mechanics, as well as the interesting age-up system that encourages technological diversity between the civilizations, I would give Age of Empires 4, if I had to put a number on it, an 8 out of 10. An interesting and in-depth strategy game. It could use some tweaks in some of the mechanics. Obviously, a lot depends on maps and map generation, which is a core part of Age of Empires. But it has a lot of the ideas there that make strategy games interesting, between putting decisions on the player and their interaction with the map and other players. Looking at it through the incredibly critical and potentially elitist lens of a competitive RTS player, how does AOE4 fare? So one of the defining characteristics of Age of Empires 4 is how unique the civilizations are. There are significant bonuses, whether it's almost 50% more range on siege weapons for the Chinese, or the fact that longbows are available en masse and without a gold cost for the English. This creates, without going into details, some very one-sided feeling interactions that leave a lot to be desired. Now, this is something I don't want to get into too much detail of because it could be easily changed and is a little map dependent, but there are already some potential glaring issues with how different the many civilizations are. So we're not yet talking in detail about the user interface, but we do have to talk a little bit about the user experience, how a player interacts with the game and what effect that has. Age of Empires 4 is pretty disappointing in this regard. Age of Empires 4 feels like we've streamlined the process of having a real-time strategy game, and it shows. In my first few dozen hours of Age of Empires 4, I found myself continually confused about which unit I was looking at, how I was supposed to select it, where it was going to go when I clicked it somewhere. Part of this is just a new RTS in general. Age of Empires 2 is not the easiest thing, even if you played it for 20 years, to see exactly what units are on the field. But Age of Empires 4 doesn't really do itself any favors. It feels like it's brought the skill floor up, but also brought the skill ceiling so low you're kind of scraping your head on it. I think we have to look at the best examples of competitive RTS today. What are the most competitive RTS today? What games have withstood the test of time, or in despite of it, are still incredibly popular to both play and watch? Starcraft 2, Age of Empires 2 with Definitive Edition, and Starcraft 1 Brood War, though maybe not so much outside of Korea. Now, what 3 things do these games have in common? Just very generally, and it's almost impossible to narrow it down, but rewarding planning, dynamic tactics, and clearly player-driven interactions. Now, what does that mean? While all of these sound like corporate buzzwords, I will try to give some quick examples. Rewarding planning. That simply means having a strong build, preparing for both either the map, the matchup, or your opponent. You see this in StarCraft 2 with the interaction, say, between Cure and Zest in the recent GSL. Cure knows that Zest is more of an aggressive player, so he prepares more defensive strategies. In Age of Empires 2, you see planning rewarded by preemptively walling off your resources when you know a player or a civilization is going to tend towards an aggressive strategy with scouts, or maybe even an early tower or something like that. Dynamic tactics. This just means the ability to adapt on the fly. The core of real-time strategy is the real-time aspect. On paper, and your Twitch chat grandmasters can come up with the most optimal 100% strategy, but everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, and the question is how you can respond to that. And both StarCraft 2 and Age of Empires 2 have a lot of punching. Clearly player-driven interaction is more of a macro sense. That means in StarCraft 2, whether you go Twilight Council or Stargate. In Age of Empires 2, whether you decide to go for a feudal age strategy or a fast castle. In Age of Empires 4, it is clearly whether you go for the military or the economic landmarks. It is the ability of players to scout, react, and adapt based on what their opponent is doing or the situation they find themselves in, whether it is a map that favors a more defensive strategy or you just find yourself forced to be aggressive in the early game. I think the combination of these three general things is what makes strategy games just so compelling. No matter how amazing or not so amazing the graphics or animations, it's not about that. Overall, a competitive strategy game should allow a player to express themselves in their style while still pitting them in real time against the mechanics of their opponent. Where that line is drawn and whether or not the focus on having 500 APM of making workers mine minerals or 500 APM on microing your archers. Is that necessary? Is that important? Well, that's up for debate, and we're going to talk about it with Age of Empires 4. While Starcraft 2 is still the Grandmaster standard and Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition brought it into the modern era, Age of Empires 4 does not really feel like the next iteration of competitive real-time strategy. In fact, I find it visually kind of comparable, especially to early Starcraft 2, but it suffers on several key fronts. One main point of real-time strategy is the ability to look at the screen, at the armies there, and understand what units are which. Those are Zerglings, those are Marines, that's easy enough. Age of Empires 2 is a little tougher. Those are Knights, those are Scouts. Age of Empires 4, and this is an issue I think could be solved relatively easily, makes it very hard to determine, okay, that's a longsword and that's a pikeman, because the way units are defined is by the outline of their weapons. Oh, you got a big spear there, and most of human history is sticking people with increasingly long pointy sticks one way or another. But when you have 30 spearmen and 20 longswords and everybody has a big weapon, which is probably compensating for something, it becomes very difficult to tell the difference, especially because of the color scheme on all the units. Generally, because the game is pretty intensely zoomed in, and now that is a matter of constant debate, but the amount of units you're able to see at one time, plus how much those units can overlap with each other, makes it very difficult to tell exactly what's going on during some of the battles. And while the aesthetic is pretty amazing, the sounds and just the general visuals of the battle are quite cinematic, the amount of control or ability to tell what's going on is relatively small. And I think this is a major sticking point and makes it hard for me to consider AOE4 particularly competitive. Honestly, a lot of it feels like it was geared towards making the battles look amazing without thinking too much about how players would actually affect the outcome once the battle was joined. When it comes to just general things, how the game works, the nuts and bolts almost literally, the game does feel like it has a lot of input lag. Like when you build a bunch of farms, it'll take a second or two before those farms actually show up. The pathfinding of units leaves a bit to be desired. While you can move through certain stands of trees, it's not incredibly clear which ones. The trees, and there's a reason in Age of Empires 2, the most popular and official mod is the Small Trees mod. The trees, much like Age of Empires 2 without that, make it very hard to see exactly what's going on the other side. Both the building grid system, the low zoom level of the game, and the wall building system combine to make a frustrating set of mechanics where you have very little control over exactly where your buildings and walls go, and it feels like the game is just trying to push you towards building in the general area as opposed to having that granularity that you'd expect from a game like StarCraft 2 or even Age of Empires 2. Just to reiterate, all of this is based off my beta, closed, and open experience, and while I don't think there will be major changes for release, there have been some things announced, whether to be added with release or otherwise. One thing that will not exist with release is the ability to mod the game. And that means, when combined with the lack of a scenario editor, there is not going to be an ability to modify your user interface. Another incredibly critical part of every competitive real-time strategy game is the minimap. It's that thing in the bottom left or right that people pretend to use and then forget about while they're microing their Marines. That is almost entirely useless in Age of Empires 4. This is something that could be easily fixed by release, but by the later game, and especially in team games, it is essentially impossible to see what your units are doing, where they are, and why they're doing it, because the icons and every other indicator clutters it so much, and there is no way to make it larger or filter it in any way. These things listed and more are some major sticking points for me as a competitive player and are very frustrating for anyone who's trying to play at a relatively high speed. I don't try to be particularly condescending when I say that. The game plays pretty well if you're sitting back, and the best way I've seen it described is a fun RTS where you don't have to worry about APM, because honestly it feels like the game kind of fights you when you do. With all these things and what we're about to talk about on the user interface, it really does feel frustrating to try to get more out of the game. As a competitive RTS, not just general gameplay, but the competitive side of things, I gotta give AOE4 a 5 out of 10. In my opinion, it's not really ready or an improvement over the well-established baseline of RTS games, and in its defense, it never really tried to be. But as it stands right now, it just doesn't feel you have that ability to affect the game that you do in the well-established competitive RTSs like Starcraft 2 or Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition. Many of these things might eventually be solved with mods or changes to the game, but a lot of them seem somewhat baked in and are unlikely or unable to change in the future. Now it's time for what I've almost literally been dying to talk to you about, and what many of you probably heard me say many strong words about during the beta. User interface and user experience. This is essentially how a player interacts directly with the game. It's hotkeys, it's the interface, it's the mini-map, it's the whole everything on top of the gameplay is UI, UX in some way or another. So how does the game feel, how intuitive, how immersive, and how rewarding is that? To be honest, for Age of Empires 4, it's pretty terrible. It feels like someone took the working and well-refined systems of Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition and Starcraft 2 and threw it out the window, came back in, and started from scratch. We're reinventing the wheel and coming out with a square. The Age of Empires 4 UI features the next of a long trend of games trying to be mobile apps on PC. The first example. Well, let me introduce you to the 4 colors available in Age of Empires 4. We have, of course, yellow for everything, and then for the user interface, we have the 3 colors of blue, green, and orange. You will see these a lot, as they are the only ones featured in the interface. One thing that immediately stuck out to me is the lack of a command panel. You know that box where you have all your units that you're currently losing in StarCraft 2 or Age of Empires 2, where you can individually pick out which one is damaged or all of a certain type or something like that? The command panel somewhat exists in Age of Empires 4, but there is no ability to individually select units from it. So that means if your villager is currently not on the relatively zoomed in part of the screen that you're currently selecting, there is no way to select an individual villager. You must click it directly on the screen. The same thing goes for selecting buildings and essentially everything else. While the game features a large grid panel with a lot of empty hotkeys immediately next to where the command panel is, the command panel offers essentially no ability to control your units that aren't directly in front of you on the screen. This is one of several things that makes me feel like whoever was designing this did not care about those with significant RTS experience. While there are hundreds of potential examples, the very short version of what you can do with a command panel of individual units is splitting off one of your idle villagers to go build a town center, or in StarCraft 2, splitting off a marine to go to a watchtower, while clicking on the minimap instead of selecting it immediately in front of you on the screen, which costs valuable seconds. The lack of a command panel is going to be a central theme throughout the user interface, and the lack of ability to really have specific control over your units and buildings. The hotkeys in Age of Empires 4, at least that we know so far, are relatively few compared to its predecessors, and also have some very frustrating issues. For example, let me describe what the Alt key does in Starcraft 2 and Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition. In Starcraft 2, the Alt key is a steal hotkey. It removes units by default from one control group to another. Like you have 10 Zerglings and a Queen on control group 1, you press Alt 2, that moves the Queen from group 1 to 2. And if you just learned that, well, congratulations. Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition has one of my favorite uses because you can set the selection to select all or smart selection. So that means if you have a bunch of pikemen and a bunch of villagers together, you drag select, well, you just select the pikemen. But if you hold the Alt key, then you can select only the villagers. This is one of the most intuitive and one of my favorite things, even over StarCraft 2 in RTS. Definitive Edition did a great job with adding a lot of these streamlined things and customizability with literally hundreds of hotkeys that make complete sense and you can modify. Well, what does the Alt key do in Age of Empires 4? One, very important, you can't rebind it. So the Alt key is bound by default to changing your camera angle. The Alt key is forced to change your camera angle. So you have the reflex to select your villagers. Well, congratulations, you're looking at them from a new, beautiful 3D angle. You Alt-tabbed for a split second, well, you come back in the game and everything looks very slightly different. I found myself Alt-tabbing and coming back and having to reset my camera. I feel this is a good example that defines the hotkey scheme of AOE4. The most of the UI and hotkeys and control scheme feel like either no attention was paid to previous well-established RTS or no care. I'm not sure which one is worse, but it is immensely frustrating as someone who is experienced and enjoys both those games to have less control and less customizability than games that are decades old. More examples of things lacking from the game that you kind of just expect. There is no ability to patrol your units. There is no patrol key. There is no hotkey that you can or can't rebind. You cannot patrol your units throughout the map. Despite the fact that the unit grid has more empty space than not, there is no ability to patrol. StarCraft 2, AOE2, honestly, I'm hard-pressed to think of another game that doesn't have a patrol key, but it seems like it was an active decision to remove it. On top of this, the waypoints are incredibly clunky and hard to use. The actual waypoint flag is sometimes larger than what you're trying to click on, whether it's a particular tree or a sheep or even a unit. Good luck getting that the first time without zooming in more than the game already is. Shift queuing units works with an asterisk, as you cannot see where the units are shift queued. There is no waypoint flag of any kind, and A-clicking shift queue does not work. You have to manually A-click each time with the shift queue to get it to work. This combined with no patrol key makes it incredibly hard to move units more than one screen at a time. This is also a little confusing to me, as StarCraft 2 especially, but also even Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition has clear shift queue waypoints that allow you to see where your units are going without just trying to memorize the location you clicked and hoping for the best. A bunch of other well-established hotkeys are lacking as well. Your only options for building hotkeys include select all military buildings and select all economic buildings, both of which include docks. You do not have the ability to hotkey any sort of building individually, which means there is very little granularity in that. This creates a feeling of a lack of control that you don't want to have in a competitive RTS. Adding to the mobile game UI experience are the fact that while we only have 3 colors, all of the same things are the same color. Trying to determine the difference between a level 2 and a level 1 horseman is not simply looking at an upgrade you're trying to research, and it's not simply looking at what they look like individually. You have to check how many dots are at the very top of that button or on the individual unit selection screen. StarCraft 2 and Age of Empires 2 already have a well-established method of demonstrating things like upgrades in the game. Age of Empires 2, while individual unit upgrades like +1 attack are a little hard to notice, when units upgrade to the next tier, they're very clearly different, like the difference between a militia and a man-at-arms. StarCraft 2 has even more obvious additions to units, especially when they get key upgrades that aren't just +1 attack. Zerglings get their wings, Marines get their combat shields. Units with other upgrades get different colored attacks, indicating they've been upgraded. Not only do all the upgrades look similar, some of them are actively confusing. For example, in order to upgrade your horsemen to level 2, you have a picture of a horse with some armor. But in order to upgrade your lancers, or effectively your knights, you have an infantry helmet with no horse on the icon. So you would have to hover over, and remember that's the lancer upgrade. It's a small thing, but it's repeated throughout almost everything in Age of Empires 4. It is immensely difficult to remember anything because everything looks the same and some of it is almost actively misleading. Another example of the UI working against the player, in my opinion, is the Select All Military Buildings button. This is what has homogenized archery ranges, barracks, stables, and docks and siege workshops. They all go into this same button. And if you select that button, it gives you a screen or a grid with all the units that you could potentially build. But wait, it doesn't actually show all the units you can build. It shows a seemingly random selection of units you can build, but sometimes, for some reason, it will prioritize units you cannot build. Say you have a barracks and archery range of stables selected, you have access to several units from each thing. You have well over 5. But when I select all of them, I have longswords, I have horsemen, I have another unit I do not have access to that is literally grayed out, and then I have maybe something from the siege workshop. And then I have a bunch of upgrades that don't necessarily match the unit. It feels, once again, like this part of the UI was designed by someone who never tried to play an RTS game with their keyboard. I know it sounds harsh and elitist, but it really gave me that impression of whoever thought this was okay has never tried to use a hotkey to do anything in an RTS game at anywhere faster than 15 APM. All of this is compounded by the fact you can only select so much on the screen at one time. For example, with Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, you zoom out and you can select maybe 30 barracks on the screen at once, maybe even more. Good luck in Age of Empires 4, as the zoom level is a lot closer to Starcraft 2. Starcraft 2, on the other hand, does give you this granularity in unit and building selection. It becomes easy to see where units are going, to select certain things, and to set up your control groups. Age of Empires 4, as we've already established, makes none of that particularly easy. That combined, especially at lower resolutions, with an inability to see much of the screen, means that my mouse was getting quite a workout at a very high sensitivity, which is very important. Almost constantly was I panning the mouse to the edge of the screen, and I was for the first time in an RTS considering using the arrow keys to move around, because I simply could not control enough stuff on one screen that it wasn't immensely frustrating. This is even more apparent in naval battles as well as siege battles, because trebuchets and ships shoot essentially more than one screen length, which means multiple times I was attacked by trebuchets. I'm staring almost directly at what's being attacked, and the unit is so far off the screen you can't even tell where it's coming from, which is obviously not a great experience in a high-level RTS game. So Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition features a production queue, essentially a production tab of all the units you're building. You can cancel them from the global production queue. Starcraft 2, you have the escape key to cancel. In Age of Empires 4, you do not have a global production queue, and the escape key brings up the menu. Since you do not have a hotkey to cancel, your only option is to individually click on whatever building you think is building the unit you didn't mean to build 5 of, and click on the button multiple times to cancel it. Now, if you have a dozen barracks, or you have a siege workshop on the other side of the map, well, good luck with that. It feels like it combines the worst of both worlds with not having a global queue to get an overview of what you're producing, and not having the ability to cancel without literally clicking on the button on the panel. Speaking of production tabs, I think it's time to talk a little bit about the Observer UI. For those of you looking forward to watching professional matches such as they are, or maybe some fun casts, the Observer UI features essentially nothing. It has no production tab. your camera view is locked to one of the players, which means if you're trying to watch a battle from the wrong perspective, you won't have the sound of anyone, though you will maybe have the vision, because you can see everyone's cam. There is no ability to zoom out any more than you can as a player, so you suffer from a lot of the same panning issues and ability or inability to see many of the battles, and any sort of stats, whether they be how much army supply, or what the player score is, which you cannot see unless you are an observer, take up a huge amount of the screen. On top of this, as of the beta, there was no replay system, so all games must be observed live if you were to do so. I'm not sure if that'll be available in release, but it might be on the long list of features that are not. Some more small examples of a lack of attention to detail are the market. The market, you can sell or buy. It's similar to Age of Empires 2, but how much gold is it to buy 100 stone? Well, you gotta hover over the market tab in order to see if you're paying 20 or 420 for 100 stone. I don't know why the functionality to just see the price is not there, but you have to individually hover over each one to see the price on the market. On top of this, your trade cards don't show up on your worker supply, though you do have the ability to see how many workers and army you have at any particular time, minus trade cards. As someone coming from Starcraft 2 and Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, the Bugatti and Lamborghini, or whatever you want to fill in there, of RTS games, the fastest, most streamlined, and highest standard, this feels like your Prius. It'll be accessible to a lot of people, but if you want to go fast, or you want to be competitive in anything, you're gonna have a tough time. Between a lot of the systems being seemingly actively and by design overlooked, things like individual unit selection off screen, and a lot of the little details like there not being the market prices and shift queue waypoints, I think some of these may eventually be added, but some of these are clearly design choices, and design choices I personally do not agree with. Overall, the Age of Empires 4 UI and user experience, I give a 3 out of 10. Because it didn't crash the game, and a lot of the buttons did what they said they did. It's just a whole lot of questionable decisions, and seemingly by design to just ignore the well-established mechanics of RTS. And while the game, I think, is not supposed to be the next most hardcore competitive RTS, it feels counterintuitive to have a game that essentially redefines the wheel and leaves you with all these less options than other established games have. Many people may have the counter argument of, well, this is an RTS that's supposed to appeal to a wider audience, a more casual audience. And to that, I ask why you're selling it for $60. Not many people are going to be super happy about this, but the way the UI feels, mostly to me, feels intentionally lazy and a misguided attempt to appeal to a more casual audience who, at that price point, will not be very interested in the game in any way, I would argue. While AOE4, in its defense, never claimed to be the next generation of competitive RTS. Obviously, there are a whole lot of players like myself, fans of both StarCraft 2 competitively and Age of Empires 2 in general, that were kind of hoping for it, and so far, from what I've seen, are going to be somewhat disappointed. Personally, what do I plan to do when Age of Empires 4 comes out? Despite everything I've said here, I'm still looking forward to it, and I think they've succeeded in that. It is a fun real-time strategy game in an era where really they're few and far between. A lot of fans are starved for any new RTS content, and of course, I'm going to do my best to give it to them. AOE4 does have the ability to spectate all matches currently happening, for better or worse, and we hope for both. With things like Bronze Age heroes, I plan on playing as competitively as possible on release because, of course, and that's who I am. Maybe even some basic guide videos, playing with other RTS fans and people, which is something that StarCraft 2 is maybe not the most conducive for. I look forward to the game, even with all the things I've described here. But honestly, I'm a bit of an addict, all right? Competitive RTS is my fix, and I'm gonna get it. no matter the price. And thank you guys for supporting that. Overall, Age of Empires 4 is a faithful addition to the Age of Empires franchise. It is recognizable. The cinematics and what they've released so far of the backstory, which is literally history in this case, looks very interesting. I think for people who are interested in Age of Empires campaigns, they will find a lot of what they like. I am looking at most of this stuff through a much more competitive and, at risk of sounding elitist again, a hardcore perspective. But the actual base game looks and sounds pretty good. It has a lot of historical depth, and they put a lot of effort into staying true to the civilizations of the day, at least to my understanding. With Age of Empires 4 release, there are some things you'd expect on release that will not be there. No scenario editor, so no major custom games like Direct Strike in SC2 or CBA in Age of Empires 2, which is a similar sort of game. No mod support, at least until, quote, early 2022. So if you like your trees not blocking half your army, well, that's just be immersed, okay, in the massive forest around you. It's unclear exactly what level of competitive matchmaking or custom game support there will be, and spectator support is lackluster at best if the beta is any indication. The UI and customization of hotkeys seems to be pretty well set, and while there were some beta bugs, I think they'll mostly be worked out by release, but there will be a significant lack of customizability, both of your own user interface and generally through things like mods. While at this time, and from my experience, I don't think it can be considered a replacement for Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition or Starcraft 2 as a competitive RTS, at least without significant changes or massive outside support. It is still going to be an Age of Empires experience, a new one I think people will enjoy. In my opinion, for those who maybe aren't as interested in the campaigns, this is a Game Pass advertisement, which unfortunately they're not paying me for this, but $1 for the first month and $10 after that seems like the best way to decide whether you want to drop $60 on an RTS that may or may not have any sort of competitive scene or even ranked ladder for the near future. Just a quick summary. The graphics look pretty good, but they aren't another generational improvement over, say, Starcraft 2. The sounds and the music are pretty great, in my opinion, especially the great dynamic musical scores. The gameplay has some really solid ideas. Overall, Age of Empires 4, I gotta give a 6 out of 10, as objectively as I can. The campaign and the single player looks very solid, and they put a lot of effort into making that an immersive experience, at least from what I've seen so far. The multiplayer leaves a lot to be desired and is heavily held back by the lack of attention, or at least lack of caring for a lot of the RTS mechanics learned in the past. So if you're looking for a more casual but fun RTS experience, and maybe for some team games with your friends, I think you will find it in Age of Empires 4. But if you're looking for something to make you stress out after work and desperately try to figure out the pinpoint build orders that will still not get you out of Diamond, well, I think you're going to have to stick with StarCraft 2 or Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition for now, as Age of Empires 4 is just not in the same league. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, or at least you found this helpful. I'm Winter, I do strategy games, and I hope that you continue to watch. Stay chill. I'll see you next time. Good luck, and have fun.